Royal Enfield Classic 500. Solid, retro looking, durable, comfortable. Basically the definition of the perfect... Wait, not that fast. Welcome to an in-depth review of another bike on this channel, and if you are not familiar with the way I'm reviewing bikes here, well, let me quickly explain that in just under 40 seconds. 5 years ago I bought my first motorcycle. Since then I have owned 6 different bikes, and obviously as someone who drove these bikes every single day and not just as a weekend fun, I started to observe and note the different positives and negatives that every single bike on the planet Earth will inevitably have. I'm not sponsored by anyone or anything. I just create this video so I can help someone who is considering buying one of the bikes I'm reviewing on this channel. Not all positives or negatives might be as such for you. It's all my observations as an everyday user. So it's completely up to you to choose what is a real positive and what is a real negative to you, and the way you are planning to use this bike. I'll start with the positive points, and the first one is something I had only on my first bike, and that is a kickstand. And no, I'm not talking about the side kickstand, which every bike should have anyway. I'm talking about the central stand, which gives you the possibility to put your bike in a straight position and also lift it a bit. That makes it much easier to deal with the maintenance or cleaning. Not sure if Royal Enfield did this specifically for this, but there's a handle on the left side of the bike that helps you to keep the bike more stable while you're lifting it with the central kickstand. Obviously, you also get the same stability when taking it off the central kickstand. And if you ever use the central kickstand without this type of handle while trying to balance it from the seat, then you would probably agree that it's a pretty useful thing to have. The next positive point is the storage options on this bike. And I'm not talking about ugly metal racks and bulky bags sticking on each side of the bike. I'm talking about something small. Something that complements the overall design of the bike, and something that can free up your pockets from paperwork, some tools, a first aid kit, and other stuff in that size range. Well, there are 2 options for this, and additionally one that I'd say is not entirely an option, but more like a little bonus that you can use. On the left side of the bike you get this much space, which originally I think is the cover for the electrical stuff, but they are properly isolated and take only around 20% of the entire space. So you get 80% of the space you can use for whatever fits in there. Then on the right side you have another compartment where all the space in there is free for you to use. Not a lot, but still, that's already 2 places where you can store some stuff that comes with the bike itself, so no need for additional installations. And finally, the bonus space I was talking about is located behind this compartment that interestingly covers the cover of whatever is behind it, but most importantly, above that you get a small space you can use for whatever that fits in there. Another positive that unites all of these compartments, which unfortunately is not always the case with other bikes, is that every single one of them has its own individual lock, which you can open with the key of the bike itself. Next positive is actually something you would mainly need during a negative situation. You might end up with this bike, or maybe if you want to show off, though no idea how that can be considered a flex, but anyways. The positive point is the Kickstarter on this bike. For those who don't know, it's that thingy I used at the beginning of the video to start the engine because the electronics were dead. I was actually interested to know a little bit about the history of the Kickstarter and quickly looked on Wikipedia, which says that kickstart mechanisms were almost universally a part of motorcycle engines before the mid-1970s and were phased out of production over the next 20 years or so as electric starters became standard equipment. There are still some motorcycles produced that have both kick and electric starters. Well, seems like the Royal Enfield Classic is one of these few bikes to use the Kickstarter, which again, for me was a big plus that saved me way more than just a couple of times. And I believe in general it's always good to have both options. The seat is not the most comfortable one, but it would be a lie if I included the comfort of it in the negative part of this video. It's just fine. I'd say you can go with it for a long distance trip, obviously with stops every hour or 2. Actually, one of the passengers noted that both the passenger and driver seat are nearly at the same level, which is much more comfortable for them to hug the driver than in some bikes where the passenger seat is much higher than the driver's seat. Plus, the size of the passenger seat is pretty good compared to some bikes where they put a tiny padding and call it a passenger seat. Gear shifting, I believe, deserves to be in the positive section of this video, because despite this bike being exposed to all possible weather conditions through not just week or months but for years, shifting the gear was pretty smooth from the moment I started to use this bike. I mean, I super rarely had troubles finding a neutral when going from 1 to 2 or vice versa. So I'd say it again that this is the positive point that deserves to be in this section. You know what else deserves a separate positive point? This. Yes, this. The brake oil reservoir that in my CF Motor review I called a jar of piss. Because in my opinion it looked like one. Thankfully and interestingly, a bike that was released 7 years ago used a better way to hide that reservoir than the bike that was released just a year ago. Turn signals and headlight are both something that I see as a positive with the way they look. I'm not talking about the system because that will be in a negative part, but design-wise, they look like they belong to this bike. I mean, at least for me, they look like something I would not consider changing even if I had a chance to. Especially these two small turn lights, I believe, look super dope. I specifically said I believe because, well, they were not working, which probably means they were either disconnected or needed some maintenance. But if they do work, together with the main turn signals, definitely a nice little addition to the overall look of the bike, which I consider as a positive. Speaking of the overall look of this bike, this will actually be the next and last positive point in this video. I mean, it's a bike that Royal Enfield claims as a retro style, that I think they achieved both with the overall look and all the little details, which I'm pretty sure will make it attractive to those who are interested in something retro looking. The simplicity of the dashboard, spokes inside the wheel rims, and even that tiny cover for the key of the tank cap that has the Royal Enfield logo, all play their role in making this bike something that you won't be surprised to see with Indiana Jones driving in the middle of some desert to get yet another artifact that will probably destroy our planet. Okay, that's probably enough. Well, it's time for all the negatives, and just looking at my notes, it looks like this is going to be longer and with more points than the positive section. Before I proceed, there is an important thing for you to keep in mind. Have you ever visited an animal rescue center where you can adopt a dog, for example, which many people do based on a combination of things like attractiveness, behavior, and etc. Well, this bike is more like a dog that no one wanted to take because of the way it looked and behaved. I mean, all rusty, taped here and there, bugs that had already built their own communities, a dead battery, and many more of what we will discuss in this section. Though, as I said before, the last time this bike was used was probably years ago, and all this time it was like a dog waiting for someone to pick it up under the rain and the sun and then rain and then sun over and over again. Some of the things that you probably noticed, like torn seats, rust and overall beat up appearance, shouldn't be a shocker considering everything this bike went through. However, I believe it's a good way to understand the longevity of this bike and what might give up after some period of time, which part of it's better to protect than deal with the rust after some period. For example, chain is kind of standard part to attract rust, especially in rainy environments. The exhaust pipe itself, which excluding that shiny cover, is entirely covered in rust. The lock for the tank cap that didn't survive even with that beautiful little cap on it. I cannot tell whether it's a poor choice of materials for some parts that was covered by rust, or any bike in the world will get a similar amount of rust if used, or better say not used and left for slow death with zero protection, but it is what it is. Something that I think worth including in the review of the bike that you may consider to get in the future. Well, the first or second, depending on how you see what I said previously, negative point is the vibrations. Again, not sure if that is because of rust doing its thing over the years or the overall build of the bike, but this thing vibrates. You can actually hear it from any video I will post with the rides on this bike, no matter how hard I try to remove that annoying sound during the editing. Obviously these vibrations will affect a lot of details, and one of them is the tank cap, which already gave up when I first sat on this bike, making that rattling sound I tried to fix with some cotton stuffed between the cap and the tank, which worked as a quick fix, but still, I think same as many people, I prefer my tank cap to be shut completely. I believe that the same vibrations probably affected some connections that made these beautiful lights useless, and I actually had to visit the place from where I rented this bike because the battery connectors kept disconnecting due to the same vibrations. Yeah, that one. How old is this motorcycle?
Around 5 years.
5 years?
Yeah. 5 years because I park in the rain,
Under the sun, yeah, rain, sun.
Every day, you know?
Yeah.
Huh?
Now it looks like it's 20 years old. Whether it's because of the rust or anything else, I think that's an issue both for the bike and for the driver or even the passenger that plans to drive more than 1 hour. So no doubt that this deserves one negative point. The next negative point is the exhaust pipe, which might be strange for some because it looks cool, kind of unusual if you look at other retro style bikes. But the problem is that this long pipe will get hot enough to burn your leg if you accidentally touch it when getting on or off the bike. I mean, after 6 different bikes, I believe the way I get on or off the bike is not that bad or clumsy to get burns on my leg. But here we are, 7th bike and first burn, which is super annoying because it took almost 2 months to heal. Well, most probably because I was still training every day, which is not that helpful for the healing process, but still. Exhaust pipe gets another negative point, personally from my left calf, which is kind of weird because the pipe is on the right side. The next negative point is one I think you would agree with me on. Just look at the fuel tank of this bike. What do you see here? Yes, it's nice. Pretty bulky, I'd say, so probably more fuel capacity, right? Well, no. It has 13.5 liters, which is almost okay until you realize that this is also including a reserve capacity of 2.5 liters. Pretty meh, to be honest. I mean, CF Moto CLC 450 has 12 liters, but the tank is less bulky than this one. Honestly, when looking at it, I thought it had at least 15 or 16 liter capacity, but unfortunately that is not the case. And this is why it gets another negative point from me. I know that I mentioned previously the simplicity of the dashboard as a small positive point, but I think the negatives will outweigh the look, especially when you hear them. First of all, turn indicators on the dashboard. There is no distinction between left and right. It will simply show you the boss. Yes, the main point of the turn signal is that the turn light signals to others where you are about to turn, but it's pretty weird that for me as a driver, it looks more like I turned on emergency lights. Which is even more strange because this bike does not have the emergency button on it. Another one is related to the gear shifting, which I also complimented in the positive section, but apart from the green light that lights up when you are in neutral, there is no indicator to show which gear you are currently in. Yes, I know this is kind of normal thing on older bikes, but if you come from a bike where you didn't need to do the math to calculate how many movements you need to reach the 2nd or 5th gear, then this might be a negative point for you, as it was for me, especially after using digital screen of CF Moto, Yamaha XSR and other bikes. The temperature indicator of the engine is also something missing that in my opinion would make a lot of sense for a bike that is not liquid cooled but air cooled, which is actually a double negative point and something that might bother you if you plan to use it for a long distance trip. Unless you plan to make stops for a bike to take some breaths and cool down a little bit. Next negative is probably something we are all guilty of when starting riding a bike, and nowadays companies help us by using a sensor system or whatever that will turn off the engine until you fix that one thing, and that is the open kickstand that some people forget to close before starting their drive, which for those who don't know is pretty dangerous. If you had that feature on your bike previously, where it would turn off the engine if the kickstand is out and you start riding, then forget about it with this bike, because it works with the kickstand open, which luckily a couple of times people around me and my passengers pointed out before I entered the main road. So that one, I think you would agree, is well-deserved negative point. Another negative point that weirdly follows me from CF Moto CLC 450 is the way to lock the front wheel. I mean, normally you would turn the key in the same ignition lock all the way to the right or left, and this is how you would lock your front wheel. Well, I think the engineers of Royal Enfield did some workshop together with people that were responsible for CF Moto CLC, because both of these bikes have a separate lock for the steering wheel, which I mentioned in my previous reviews, because when your sleepy mind tries to start the bike, you will find yourself in the situation where the bike is on, but the front wheel is still blocked. So you need to turn off the bike, take the key out, put it in a separate lock, and then start the bike again. Pretty meh, if you ask me. If you remember, I mentioned that I like the overall look of this bike and the majority of the details, but the majority is not all. And one thing that I really didn't like, which again for me takes place in the negative section, and for you might be tolerable or even a positive thing, is the mirrors. I think this bike deserved better designed mirrors that complement the overall look instead of looking like two antennas of some weird looking insect. The last one, which I can easily put here as a negative, is the power of this bike, which probably some of you saw that coming because I didn't mention anything about it in the positive section. 27 horsepower, 500cc engine, but sorry, it's not fast. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not bad, it's not slow or anything, it's enough to feel okay on the highway, but it's definitely not the bike towards which I'd say the most cliche type of phrase many bike reviewers used in their videos. Oh, it has a kick to it. No, there is no kick. I personally expected something different coming from a 450cc bike, but not that type of different. So yeah, that is the last point for the team negative. Now to the most important question. Would I buy this bike if I get a chance in the future? The answer is no. I mean, I'm ready to get CF Moto CLC 450 with all the negatives that I listed in one of the reviews, because the positives outweigh these negatives easily. But unfortunately, no matter how good this bike looks for its retro style and all the positives that I mentioned, they simply cannot compete with the negatives. Though, with that being said, that is my opinion, the list of negatives and positives that I observed. I might be wrong with something, and you might not see some of the negative points as such, and that's great. My job in listing all my observations while using this bike and putting them into these two sections is done here. Thank you for watching until the end, and if you liked the content, well, this is going to be my first time asking you to subscribe and like this video. Thank you again, and see you somewhere else.